While attending the World's Fair in Buffalo, New York in 1901, President William McKinley was shot by a would-be assassin. While he was severely wounded, he did not die right away. The vice president at that time was Theodore Roosevelt. We're going to be talking a great deal about him in just a few moments. It wasn't clear the severity of McKinley's wound at that particular time. And so Teddy Roosevelt, as was his way, decided to head out into the mountains with his sons for a long-awaited hiking trip. While he is in the mountains, McKinley's condition worsens, and in fact, McKinley dies. And so some poor sap has to hike up into the mountains and go find Teddy Roosevelt to let him know that, in fact, he is the President of the United States. This little anecdote tells us a little bit about Teddy Roosevelt. He is certainly the most outdoorsy, sort of rugged, dynamic president up to that point. He was the youngest president up to that point. He had a reputation as a daring military soldier. At the same time, this is a little reckless, isn't it? Some might question the decision to choose that moment to hike off into the mountains with your sons when the President of the United States is mortally wounded. But these qualities in some ways define Teddy Roosevelt. He is a man of action. He is in some ways a little reckless, driving forward. He is an irresistible force. He was also an intellectual. While not a professional scholar, he had written a number of expansive histories prior to becoming president. He wrote a many-volume history of the American Navy and a many-volume history of the American Indians. Teddy Roosevelt rose through New York politics, much as his sort of distant cousin Franklin Roosevelt, who will follow him later. He served as police commissioner in New York City. I believe I talked about him accompanying Jacob Riis, the photographer, walking the streets of New York City and examining crime scenes in the slums in the middle of the night. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy just before the Spanish-American War. I mentioned his experience with the Rough Riders. And then Governor of New York before being selected to run on the ticket with McKinley as Vice President. Teddy Roosevelt was an incredibly charismatic figure, commanding speaker again, young, dashing. Franklin Roosevelt would describe him later saying that at every funeral he must be the corpse, at every wedding he must be the bride. Gives you a sense of the kind of person Teddy Roosevelt was, right? We all know these kind of people, the sort who, anytime they walk into a room, all the attention is on them. They kind of suck the air out of the room. In fact, we have a phrase describing this for Teddy Roosevelt, and that is that he transformed the presidency into what we call the bully pulpit. The bully pulpit. Prior to Teddy Roosevelt, one could make the argument that the most prominent politicians in Washington, D.C. were perhaps senators, congressmen, a Supreme Court justice, and the president was just one of these actors. There were many others of similar stature. Not Teddy Roosevelt. He stands head and shoulders above everyone else. This is the bully pulpit. And yet he does have this kind of childlike, reckless, spoiled, stubborn way of acting sometimes that led at one point the British foreign minister to comment, "The President of the United States is a boy of 12. So this is the man who assumes control in the White House in 1901. His diplomacy is often described using the cliché of the big stick. Walk softly and carry a big stick, as the saying went. So more or less let people go about their way unless they need straightening out. And then we will implement force. We will sort of bully people around or push them around. There are a number of examples of this big stick diplomacy, and I'll share a couple of them here. The most famous, perhaps, is the episode leading to the Panama Canal. And so there is a little bit of background necessary for this. The United States had been contemplating some sort of canal across the Isthmus of South America for decades, really since the gold rush and the development of California. People had been looking for a quicker and easier way to get out to the west. Certainly military escapades like the Spanish-American War heightened the need for something like the Panama Canal. And so the United States had been looking for a long time at negotiating a route across South America somewhere. I mean, the problem is these are foreign nations. We don't own this territory. We don't control them. So we had to negotiate if we were going to build a canal like this. Which leads us to Panama specifically. Panama ultimately is going to be carved out of the nation of Colombia. And so after looking at any number of different possible routes for digging a canal, we had settled on a path through Colombia. And for several years, actually, we had been negotiating with Colombia to try to secure the territory so we could dig the canal. These negotiations kind of stopped and started, rose and fell. And in 1903, Teddy Roosevelt and the Americans thought to be very close to securing a deal with Colombia. At the last minute, Colombia backed out, decided they didn't want to do this. And Teddy Roosevelt, furious, sent the American Navy down off the coast of Colombia, and on November 3rd, 1903, with American backing, the Panamanians launched a revolution against Colombia. It was a bloodless revolution, lasted all of 49 minutes. The Colombians understood that with American warships at the ready, they had no chance of preventing this revolution. And so, very quickly after that, the United States secured the rights to what would become the Canal Zone, and were able to begin undertaking the process of building the canal. But this is the big stick at work. We will try to negotiate, we will try to come to terms, but when things fell apart, Roosevelt was very quick to implement American force. The building of the canal itself also tells us a little bit about Roosevelt's character, and perhaps in some ways this big stick. The project of digging and building the canal, which was an incredibly arduous engineering challenge, had kind of stalled. The process was moving very slowly. There were lots of different problems. We discovered that mosquitoes and malaria became a huge problem. We're digging this canal, and people are down there in the muck, and mosquitoes were everywhere. And so for several years, the project really was going nowhere. Until finally, in 1906, frustrated and tired of reading these negative reports about the progress being made on the canal, Teddy Roosevelt put on his hip boots, hip waders, and went down to Panama himself, the thought being, I'm going to dig the darn thing on my own if it's not getting done. This is the sort of thing that Teddy Roosevelt would do. And there are lots of pictures of him going about this process. You see one of him here. He's in the tractor or whatever that machine is. He's actually going to try to dig the canal on his own. While we might say this is sort of foolish and rash and childish and even silly, it also sparked the nation to action. It drew the attention of the country. We were just captivated by this guy, this man of action. And following that, the digging of the canal became a great source of national pride. It became a project of huge note in terms of what the country was doing. And by 1915, at last, the canal was complete. But it is largely Roosevelt's personal direction and drive that sparked the process of building the canal. This is just a map illustrating the route of the Panama Canal across the Isthmus of Central America. And you get a sense from this of the challenges presented to the engineers who built the canal. It's not readily evident in this, but there's also a significant change in elevation from one side to the other. The one ocean is something like 100 feet higher than the other. And so the challenge was, how do you actually raise gigantic warships up 100 feet or more? And the answer is in the ingenious series of locks that are built in the Panama Canal. Perhaps some of you have been through the canal. It's one of those things on my bucket list. I've never done it, but I've seen videos of it and read about it. It's an intriguing engineering process. You pull the ship into one of the locks, and then it's pumped full of water, and like a bathtub, raising everything up, the ship will rise. It can then move forward into the next lock, where the process repeats itself again. Truly a fantastic engineering marvel. It is in many ways under Teddy Roosevelt that the United States really embraced an active role in terms of diplomacy all around the world. This idea of big stick diplomacy is part of that. As another example, in his 1904 State of the Union address, Roosevelt announced a policy that would become known as the Roosevelt Corollary. And corollary meaning kind of an extension or an addition to something that already exists. And in this case, it's the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And what Roosevelt says, essentially, in this State of the Union address, is that the United States reserves the right to intervene anywhere in this hemisphere to protect our own interests. And so, in essence, what Roosevelt is doing is extending the Platt Amendment. Remember, we talked about the Platt Amendment in Cuba. Extending the Platt Amendment to all of Latin America. Again, this is a very aggressive sort of policy, and we did act on it in a number of different cases, intervening in other parts of Latin America. Roosevelt is very active as well in the Far East and in Asia. I'll just comment very briefly here. I encourage you to review your textbook, which goes into more extensive detail, particularly about the United States' relationship with Japan, which was on again, off again during this period. We were concerned about a number of issues with Japan, from Japanese immigration into our country to the treatment of Japanese immigrants in the United States, and so on. Roosevelt was very concerned about what was happening in Asia, and in fact, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize at one point for overseeing peace between Japan and Russia. But as part of this idea of the big stick, the kind of footnote on this policy came in 1907, when Roosevelt sent what we called the Great White Fleet on a worldwide tour. The Great White Fleet was the magnificently outfitted and updated American Navy. And you see a picture of it there below, chugging across the ocean. Roosevelt was sending the fleet around the world as a message to everyone that this is what the United States has now. We are now a power of note. But this was particularly of interest when the Navy was sent to Japan. Again, affairs with Japan sort of rocky at times. Some people were worried. Here you are sending our Navy pre-announced into the harbors of Japan. they could do anything at that point. If they choose, they could attack. And yet, they didn't. Everything went well, everything went peacefully, and in fact, this Great White Fleet, another example of Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, was a smashing success. This cartoon in many ways summarizes our approach to diplomacy in the age of Teddy Roosevelt. The big stick in the Caribbean Sea, Roosevelt strides across the Caribbean with absolute confidence, wielding his big stick as necessary. This philosophy is not far from the way of thinking that will lead us in the near future into World War I, the next chapter that we will be studying. The United States was not yet a great world power, even on the verge of World War I, but it was certainly on the rise. It was coming on. What we will see as we discuss the policies of Woodrow Wilson at the beginning of the next chapter is that he was not so eager to engage the United States in any war, but especially a major war like World War I. Of course, the way things played out during the war, it became inevitable that the United States participate.